In the last video, we solved Fibonacci using recursion, and we saw the recursion method was very simple to write. However, it was very inefficient to execute. So we need to find a different way to solve Fibonacci, and in this video, we're going to try to solve it using Python lists and dynamic programming. So the idea here is to create a list for the first two numbers of Fibonacci that we know, f of 0. So let's write that down. Fibonacci. So we know that Fibonacci of 0 is 0, and Fibonacci of 1 equals 1. So if we have a list here, so to calculate Fibonacci of 2, so we're kind of walking through the Fibonacci equation. So Fibonacci of 2 equals Fibonacci of 1 plus Fibonacci of 0. So since we know what 1 and 0 are, we can just add the two numbers and we store them in the list. Fibonacci of 3 is Fibonacci of 2 plus Fibonacci of 1. We know what Fibonacci of 2, which is 1. We know what Fibonacci of 1, which is 1. So 1 plus 1 is 2. Fibonacci of 4 is Fibonacci of 3 plus Fibonacci of 2. We know what Fibonacci of 3 is because we just calculated it, and it's 2. And Fibonacci of 2 is 1. So 2 plus 1 is 3. And that's the idea. We create a list, initial list that only has 0 and 1. And then we start iterating from the last element in the list all the way to n, which is the number that we're trying to calculate Fibonacci for. And we calculate Fibonacci for each number all the way until we reach the end, and we return the very last two numbers, the sum of the very last two numbers in that list. That way we don't have to recalculate every order of Fibonacci if we have calculated it already, and when we calculate it, we store it in a Python list. So let's see how that looks like in Python. Let's activate IPython. IPython. So diff Fibonacci of n, and let's call this list f. It will only have the two numbers that we know, 0 and 1. And we use the same if statement in the recursion solution. If n is less than 2, just return n. Otherwise, you need to iterate from 2, and the reason we're iterating from 2 is because we know what the 0 element and the first element of the list, all the way to n, the number that we're calculating. Now we need to append that list with the addition of the last two numbers that are stored in the list, and that is f of I minus 1 plus f of I minus 2. Last thing we need to do is return the very last, so we need to add the very last two elements in the list, And in Python, to do that in Python is just f of -1 and f of -2. So let's try that. Let's try 1. That should return 1, the very first if statement. Let's test the other, the else statement and the iteration. If we want Fibonacci of 4, we should get 3. That's 3. Let's try 10. 55. And from the last video, we tried to get Fibonacci of 100, and that kind of, we had to interrupt it because it was taking very long. So let's see if this actually takes the same amount of time or shorter. So that was obviously so much faster.